And this is part 2.
Okay, welcome back. So what we've talked to, what I've talked about up to this point, I think is, I consider more of the basic information that likely is a refresher or you likely already know. We're now moving to cover things that maybe you're not as familiar with. So here we're going to identify and solve the problem. So this is a real world problem, and looking at the framework, curriculum framework, solving real world problems is I think is a theme that's carried throughout a lot of it. Also interdisciplinary, and so that's where this is. We're going to start to introduce some of those things. So first of all, what is the problem? I mean, again, you've heard about pollinator decline. There's no question that there are some species that are in serious trouble. So if we look at here, I have some data from Massachusetts. So high elevations above 1,000 feet, low elevations below 1,000 feet. That tends to be where we see new species. So at higher elevation, there are more species than at lower elevations, a couple more. And so what I did was looked at historical records from different museum specimens in different and specific areas. And then I went back to those areas and collected bumblebees from those areas and compared the two. And what you can see, if low elevation, in a lot of cases, the blue bars are above the yellow bars. And in many cases, and unfortunately, in a few cases, there are no yellow bars. So Bombus affinis is the bumblebee, rusty patch bumblebee it's shown here as the one that's on the endangered species list. And but there are others like Pennsylvanicus and Terricola that used to be at low elevations, but we don't see them anymore. Similarly, at high elevations, we see affinis is no longer there, and we see a lot of dramatic drops in Terricola. So it is there, and it is in the Greenfield area, alive and well, and Bagans and some of these other ones. But certainly the numbers are much lower than they used to be. So Terricola, for example, was top 3 in terms of abundance, and now it's in the bottom. It's at the bottom of the list. There are only 11 species shown here. As I said, there's a 12th, so I haven't updated my figure. So there are definitely species that are in serious trouble. Now, what I want to point out here, and this is a very important point, is that you notice that there are also cases where the yellow bars are much, much higher than the blue bars. And what this means is, especially with this Bombus impatiens down here, that while some species are headed in the direction of extinction, some have increased and expanded their range. They're more abundant than they've ever been, and whatever we're doing to kill off some, others are doing very well. And some are very abundant in areas where they didn't used to be very abundant. So they're expanding their ranges. So when you hear about pollinator decline, immediately people think everything's in trouble. So if I plant something and it brings something in, I'm doing a good thing. Although, something is better than nothing, in the case of these declines, and this is true for butterflies, not just bumblebees, but other things as well, other pollinator types, is that there are species, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Bumblebees are not in trouble. Some are in serious trouble and others are not. So this is where we start to separate out where we need to target things in trouble. And if we see a lot of bumblebees, it's not necessarily a good thing. In August, I can guarantee you, in most places at low elevation, you're going to see thousands of Bombus impatiens. But there should be 5 or 6 other species there at that time that you are not seeing. And so even though it looks great, you have lots of bees on your plants, unless you know which species it is, you're not necessarily helping. It's not a healthy pollinator habitat. And as I mentioned, not just bees, there are 25 butterfly species in Massachusetts that are at varying degrees of decline. I'd say many of these are located in your area. I have a complete list of those butterflies as well, which we'll get to tomorrow probably. And so what this is called it's called differential declines, right? There's some declining and there are some increasing and some have remained stable over time. Historical data, by the way, was pre-2000. current data is post 2000. So something happened in the 90s that started aphanus in rapid decline in these other species. And we're trying to figure out what exactly that is. So if we look at the, again, the pollinator decline issue, you think of bees, and typically you think of honeybees, and you think about agriculture. So this is definitely one side of the equation. So the pollinator decline has two sides. This side's received a considerable amount of attention. It is extremely important, obviously, but it's not, the other side is equally important, and it's basically been neglected. So if we look at the difference between the two, in an agricultural setting, we tend to have, in the terms of the pollinators, we have a handful of species. The honeybee, which is a non-native species, is very important in this context. And there are a couple of native species that are important. But I want to point out that only 5% of those thousands of species that I talked about actually visit crop plants. Crop plants are not good sources of nectar and pollen. And if you have large numbers that can exploit those flowers, then great. But the vast majority of things aren't looking, because the chemistry's off, the pollen quality is not right. For whatever reason, they're just not in these, visiting these crops. I talked about 17,000 native plant species. Here we're talking about a handful of species, and they may have been native at one point, but they're far from it due to artificial selection. So we've got a handful of pollinators, a handful of plants, and it's serving one species, and that's us. I mean, we can include agricultural and like cows and things if you want. But of course, that one species is extremely important, right? So we've got, I'm not saying that this isn't important, but what happens is that the honeybee's importance in this context is being brought into the other context. So here, all that matters is that I have enough individuals to do the pollinating. It doesn't matter how many types of, or how many species I have, it's the number. So if I can do it with 100,000 honeybees, my job's done and everything is healthy in an agricultural context. With the decline in honeybees due to colony collapse disorder, people have been thinking that, oh, we should turn to wild bees. Well, not very many wild bees are visiting crop plants, and so they're targeting those common species that would visit these crop plants. That's a problem because they're not targeting the species in decline. And species in decline don't have the numbers to do all this pollination. And so they're being lost. They're being used as an argument to get money to do this, but they aren't being helped in any way. If we flip things to the ecological importance of pollinators, this is where our idea of pollination system comes in, where it's the native plant and the native pollinator together. And together, those interactions are called keystone interactions. Why? Because those interactions are supporting diversity at other, what are called trophic levels. So we've got our diversity of interactions. We've got our butterfly pollinated plants, our long and short-tongued bee pollinated plants. We've got our fly pollinated plants. All of those are producing, seeds, fruit, shelter, and nest sites for things at this trophic level. Right? So so it's thousands of species pollinating thousands of species, supporting hundreds to thousands of species, and those species are supporting things higher up. Right? So if we got our small mammals, they're being eaten by our foxes and other things, and so as we start to degrade these systems, which includes not just the animal, but the plant isn't producing the food or the nest sites or the shelter this site needs, and they start to die off. And eventually what happens is you get what's called ecosystem collapse. A massive reduction in biodiversity, a massive reduction in ecosystem health, and we get the loss of what are called ecosystem services. So these are services we get from nature for free. Pollination is one. Water purification, decomposition, carbon sequestration are all things that healthy ecosystems give us that are, when it comes down to it, generated by the diversity of what we have down here. So in an ecological context, diversity is really all that matters. I mean, certainly abundance is in there as well, but we need to maintain diversity of systems to support diversity of wildlife at other trophic levels and keep everything in those processes going. The honeybee plays no role here, none. There are no native honeybee pollinated plants because it's a non-native species. And so putting a honeybee in here is really putting in an introduced species and upsetting the balance here because they're competing for resources here. And so while the honeybee has a tremendously important role in agriculture and wild bees less so, In this context, it's the reverse. And that point is missed across the board. They're lumped together. And what also is missed is, you hear, oh, well, we have to save the pollinators because they pollinate native plants. Well, it doesn't just stop there. Those native plants are the connection to the rest of this system. If I was able to create a feeder that would feed the thousands of pollinator species that we have and keep them going, and this diversity is maintained at the expense of the plant, this would still collapse. So it's not about saving the animal, it's about saving the system. That is the main point that's missed in pretty much every single pollinator conservation discussion that I've heard. They stop short, or they just focus on the agricultural side of things. So when we bring this into the classroom and we want to address ecosystems and all those other core concepts, we really need to bring this side of things into it. Certainly the other side can be brought in as well, but this needs equal attention, and that just isn't happening to the degree that it should. So we look at ecological importance as an example, and I talked about this before. So we've got the importance of the animals by themselves as prey, so both at the larval stage and the adult stage. We've got our birds feeding. But after the pollination event, what are called products of pollination, what do we get? We get nest material for birds. We get food for birds. We take out the pollinators, we're losing something here, but we're losing much more over here, potentially. And so that's why when we think about ecological importance, we're not just thinking about even the interaction, we're thinking about what is it that uses this plant for food, shelter, and nest site. And do we have this plant, and do we have enough of the pollinator? So you need both sufficient amounts of the pollinator and that plant to support the other levels. So this brings in what's called functional diversity. And the difference is simply, what is it that diversity is doing to maintain those ecosystem services, ecosystem health, and the biodiversity at those other levels? So to separate them, we've got abundance, which is pretty straightforward. You've got a lot of one thing. Richness, or what people think is species richness or species diversity, is just how many different things you have. So here we have 3 different species, so it's certainly more diverse than we have here. But if we look over here, we have 3 species, but we have a long tongue, a short tongue, and a medium tongue pollinator species and the respective plant. Here we have 3 species, but we have functional diversity, much more functional diversity than we do here. These are all medium tongue species. So 1 functional group. Here we have 3 functional groups. And if we look within bumblebees, we've got short, medium, and long tongue bumblebees, and they are paired up with tubular flowers or open composite flowers. So they have their matches based on their morphology, and also some other, some chemistry in there as well, which we'll talk about. But we have short, medium, and long tongue bees. So they're supporting those other trophic levels as well. The problem is that everything in decline falls into this category. Even Bombus affinis, which has a really short tongue, performs a behavior called nectar robbing. So it likes long tubular flowers, but instead of using a long tongue to get the nectar, it robs it. It bites a hole at the base of the flower and sticks its short tongue in to get the nectar. It cheats. It's cheating the plants, but it's what's called a co-evolutionary stable, or an evolutionary stable strategy in those systems. And so all of this category has been knocked out. And everything that's attached to this category in terms of the ecological network has also been affected. If you look at birds and mammals that are relying on certain plant species, and the plant species themselves. So to drive this point home, when you say, let's conserve the pollinators, let's save the bees versus let's save pollination systems, the difference is, and this is using hummingbirds instead of bees as an example, if I could put up hummingbird feeders, everybody loves them. Look at all the birds I have, great. If you're a hummingbird and you have the choice of going to hundreds of flowers and moving around and trying to find them versus going to one-stop shopping where you get unlimited supply of nectar, where are you going to go? Well, you're going to move over here. When you do that, what's going to happen here? No pollination, no seeds or fruit produced for other animals. And so although this is saving the hummingbirds, you're losing far more species by putting this up than you're gaining. And by the way, hummingbirds have come into areas with no flowers. They feed on sap, they feed on insects. They can get by just fine. But of course, they're going to come to feeders because they you know, it's an easy source for them. So why wouldn't you? They're very smart, just like the bees, and they're going to do that. I could swap out a feeder for a non-native plant, European honeysuckle. Again, hummingbirds might be extremely happy, and they may actually pollinate European honeysuckle, but the birds don't like the seeds, or they don't like to nest in the honeysuckle plants, or there's no butterfly host, no butterfly species wants to use it as a host plant, and it starts to outcompete the natives that they do like. You can see how that is going to break down the system as well. So we really need to focus on native pollination systems and those pairings and maintaining that functional diversity rather than the pollinators and just keeping the animals happy. It's far more complicated than that when it comes to conservation, and learning about pollinators and pollination should incorporate elements of this into the discussion. So why are our systems in trouble? When things started back in the day, so I've been working on this for 20 years. So let me put it this way, Aphanus was so abundant in my study areas that I considered it a pest because it, like Terricola, bites holes in the base of flowers. It's a nectar robber. And I couldn't find flowers that hadn't been robbed, and I needed them because I was looking at behavior of long-tongued bees. Fast forward 5, 7, 8 years, and I couldn't find Aphanus anywhere. It was completely in less than 10 years, was completely gone, hundreds of miles from my study site. And we looked at what might be causing these rapid declines. And originally we thought it was infectious agents. We thought that the parasites were moving from commercial greenhouses out into the wild. And we did a bunch of studies there. It's called pathogen spillover. And actually with the COVID-19, pathogen spillover event started it, right? The pathogen moved from one species to us. Here, it's moving between bumblebee species. So it's moving from Bombus impatiens in greenhouses to every other bumblebee species that's visiting flowers that are contaminated with the pathogen. Moving forward, pesticides became in vogue. And certainly, so infectious agents are still an issue. There's actually spillover now going from honeybees to native bees. But pesticides, the neonics in particular, I've done a lot of work here. So my research program covers all of this, and I've studied effects of pesticides fairly extensively, the neonics in particular, and they are not good things, and they are not helping anything in agricultural areas or urban areas where you use neonics. So the neonics are affecting the sensory system, which is affecting the behavior, which is affecting both the animal and the plant side of the equation, and then they're also having other effects in other systems as well. But before these pesticides came on the scene, we started to see these declines. And I think most people in the game would agree that either habitat change or climate change, and possibly a sprinkling of exotic species, these are the major driving forces for wild pollinator decline. In agricultural areas, this is amplifying the issue, and it's not a good thing. But we're seeing declines in areas where there's low pesticide use, so there's something else at play. And I'll talk a bit now about our research on habitat change, because this relates to, well, if we've changed the habitat, what have we changed and what do we need to bring back? And exotic species, what impact is it having? Is it the honeybees? Is it, so non-native bees, or is it non-native plants? And also climate change. So climate change, we definitely have good evidence that climate change is putting things out of sync. And I think this year is a good example. So this year, there were plants in bloom before the bees got out, and they went out of bloom when the queens came out. Things like willow. Pussy willow here anyway was out of bloom when the queens were out, and that's a major source of pollen and nectar, and so that has cascading effects as you move on if those populations can't bounce back. But anyway, so if we look at then these different potential causal factors, we need to then think about, all right, we know that certain species are in trouble and others aren't. We have this idea that certain things are causing these declines. It makes sense that we should be looking at how these things affect the threatened species. Unfortunately, we are not. So when we look at pesticide testing, it's on Bombus impatiens, which is common and not affected by anything. They're not looking at it with Bombus aphanus or other things that are in decline that are a bit more abundant. So I'm advocating, and this is where the Beecology Project, it was born, or this is the basis for the Beecology Project. What I call ecological conservation is that we need to think about all species and all life stages, not just the things visiting flowers, but we have to think about nest sites. We have to think about host plants. And we need to keep all of that in balance throughout the season and target those threatened species. So species at risk. In the case of monarch butterflies, at the larval stage, they're highly specialist. So we need to think about that. At the adult stage, they're generalists. They'll visit pretty much anything they can get their tongue onto. So this difference, we need to consider these differences, that if you don't have milkweed, you will never have adult monarchs. And there are other species that are the same, that if you don't give them the larval food that they need, you will not get the butterflies visiting the flowers no matter how many you put in. In the case of bees, they all follow the same cycle. Over the winter, they're in the dormant stage. In the spring, they come out and they look for nest sites. So, social bees and solitary bees are doing the same thing. They're laying their eggs and they're pupating, and the adults are emerging through the summer as they collect pollen and nectar. Pollen is their source of protein. You do not make new bees without pollen. That's another important point we'll come back to. Nectar is their fuel. So if you don't give them nectar, they die in a couple of days. If you don't give them pollen, a good source of pollen, they cannot make new bees, and that's going to affect the population. At the end of the cycle, we get mating taking place. Sometimes we get mating up here, and we go through the dormant phase, the overwintering phase, and they need to find good places to overwinter. So all of this needs to be covered. So if you put in plants that help them here, but they have no nest sites, they don't have a good overwintering site, you're never going to get them to this stage. So the focus should be in the spring and should be at these key life stages, and that's what we're trying to do. The problem is that when you look at plant lists that are out there and you look at approaches, it's got this one-size-fits-all approach. You put them out, it's what's good for one is good for them all, and I'll show you data, and that's, I've got tons of data to back this up. It is not only not helping, but it is hurting the species in trouble, because what you're doing here is you're helping the common species get more common, and they're out competing the threatened species. So we need to change our way of thinking. So let's think about that. So we're going to talk about threatened species, the threatened bees, all of these threatened butterflies. If I just planted willow, 4 species of willow, and they're on my plant list that I sent to you, that can bloom consecutively, and if you can get male plants, that's great because they have pollen, the female just has nectar, you would be able to supply nectar and pollen, enough nectar and pollen to keep all of these threatened bees going. Butterflies in the flight stage, these are all threatened butterfly species that need nectar, that use the willows for nectar. And also there's a threatened species that uses it as a host plant. So what we want to find is that those plant species where you have maximum positive effect on threatened species. We're not just pulling in anything, we're pulling in specific things. And we'll see when we assess habitats and we go out and do learning exercises or whatever, I said there should be 10 species. And if you don't see 10 species or close to it by up until about August, something is wrong and you need to change. And so that's one of the reasons working with bumblebees is that they're easy to identify and it's easy to figure out these relationships. Some of the other bees are smaller, and we're bringing butterflies into the Beecology Project as well. And again, I'll talk about this in a second. Now, we don't want to just think about not about the animal, we want to think about the plants. As I said, the plants are declining, native plants are declining in parallel with the native pollinators of those plants. A great example of that is hairy beardtongue. So, hairy beardtongue is a state-listed species. It provides nectar for all of these threatened species, right? And so if we plant hairy beardtongue, not only helping these, but everything else that uses hairy beardtongue, like the other wildlife that's relying on hairy beardtongue. So by putting in these native species, we're helping to restore those ecological connections. The plant is the connector. The native plant is the connector. The pollinator helps to keep that connector going. But as I said, without that plant, you might be able to keep the pollinators going, but you're not keeping the rest of the system going. And on my plant list, there's another one. There's some hypericum, St. John's wort, and some other things on the list. We could talk about that later. And it's not just about the flowers. As I mentioned, we are looking for host plants, big and little blue stem, switchgrass. These are important host plants for our threatened butterflies. They also form food source for our threatened or for birds. Right? They're feeding on the seeds. They actually prefer native seeds over non-native seeds. Now, you're probably thinking, where do bees come in? Well, It turns out that if you have a lot of native grasses, our native rodent species love to nest in those native grasses. And this does two things. It helps to feed and support our threatened bird species like owls, but also our bumblebees. They don't build nests on their own. They don't dig into the ground. They use abandoned rodent holes. So the rodents are making nests over the winter. They abandon those nests, and the bumblebee queens move in and set up shop. If we get rid of rodents, we are affecting bumblebee populations directly. And I've got students, and I'm collaborating to work on this idea, that the hypothesis is that the threatened species are looking for specific rodent nests. And we get rid of the rodents, we're losing those species right out of the gate. Okay, so there's more to it than just the flowers. You need, in the habitat, you need to have large areas with these host plants and these grasses to help to support those connections. Okay, so how do we, so I've talked a lot about what we should do, but what actually, what sort of conceptually, here's what we should be thinking about. What do we actually do? And this is, what do I plant? And what you plant should be based on, and I've got it in caps and an exclamation point, so it must be important. It's all based on research. Surprisingly, we do not have research, the research that we need on threatened species to be able to save them. It is shocking to me that there are larger conservation groups like Xerces, pollinator.org, that have been working on this longer than I have, just because I took a hiatus when I went to UMass Medical School to work on monarch butterflies, but that's another story. When I got back into the game, there's been no progress. And they're selecting plants based on anecdotal evidence. They're talking about nest sites based on anecdotal evidence. There's no real research targeting these threatened species. And so I wanted to fill this critical knowledge gap, and that's where the Beecology Project came from. Looking at the plant lists, I knew that a lot of those, the threatened species don't visit the plants on the list. So they're not, it's not helping anything. It's bringing in abundance and common species, but it's not helping the species that need it. So we need to switch our view and get more comprehensive lists that really target. And to do that, we need data. So everything I do is data driven. The plant lists that I've given you are all based on data collected from multiple sites across the state over multiple years. And I see patterns, and those patterns I'm passing along to you, because I know when you put those in that you're going to be able to support those threatened species. So let's look at bumblebees. Again, bumblebees, in terms of citizen science, which we're getting to, is, and in terms of middle school, like my son and daughter can ID the different bumblebee species. They know this one's in Patience because it's so common, it's easy to identify, and this one's not in Patience. And at that level, it's still good that you're seeing something different. They can appreciate the diversity. But in terms, so here are the bumblebees. I've given you this sheet. It's got the Bombus sandersoni is on there around here. But in red, these are the species that are in trouble. So Aphanus and Pennsylvanicus are likely, well, I think I've seen one of these, but Pennsylvanicus I haven't seen. I have to follow up with this. But certainly you have 3 in your area that you should have on your property if you have the proper habitat for these species. And so the question is, what should you put in to help these species? Can I just throw anything down, or should I be a little bit more specific? You can see there are some low, high elevation, and the species at risk are given, and whether they're abundant as well. So you're going to see a lot of these ones right now, Bombus bimaculatus and Impatiens. You'll see a lot of. The good thing is the ones that are in trouble are more interesting, like easy to identify. They're all yellow or they're black or something like that. And we'll get to that tomorrow. So what do? We basically go out to different areas in the state. So I've got sites, this is from a few years ago, I've got sites now all through Western Mass, into Central, and now, because I'm at Dartmouth, I've got sites down in here as well. And so we walk through and we do transects once a week from May-ish, April now, because we're getting into queen behavior, all the way through first hard frost. And we're recording the species, queen worker male, and this is what you can do with the students as well. This is part of the citizen science. You do these types of walks. Nectar and pollen foraging, which I'll get to. How abundant is the resource? Is it a native or exotic species, habitat characteristics, and this type of thing. And what we found is that, not surprisingly, each species has a unique set of preferences for nectar. So here are data for July. This is just July. we saw 25 bumblebees, a bumblebee on 25 different plant species. But when we look at the proportion of each species visiting a particular plant species, it's not even. It's not randomly distributed. So here are short-tongue, medium-tongue, and long-tongue species. And the first thing you notice is that long-tongue bees like to match up with tubular flowers. Red clover and vetch for vagans and fervidus, which are in trouble, are major sources of nectar. In fact, I'll go to areas, pollinator gardens. I've gone to Tower Hill Botanic Garden, and they have hundreds of plants in bloom. The only place I saw fervidus was off-site on red clover and vetch. They weren't anywhere on the main site with all of that diversity. They're doing their thing, and they have their preferences. Bombus terricola is another one in trouble. It loves milkweed. 80% of the terricola that I saw in July were on milkweed. So that obviously, if we're trying to save terricola, we need a lot of milkweed and different species of milkweed. Fervidus, these are non-natives. We're going to come back to how we show the natives that we can swap them out for. The other thing I want to point out is that even within tongue length categories, we see very different preferences. Bombus impatiens, the common one, loves purple loosestrife. These other ones hate purple loosestrife. So you'll see tons of honeybees and bumblebees on purple loosestrife, and they'll get their numbers up in the thousands, but these other ones don't like it. So as purple loosestrife outcompetes natives, you're pushing these other species out of the off the habitat. So why is it then that they have these different preferences? And the answer is nectar chemistry and pollen chemistry. And I'm collaborating with somebody at Cornell to look at what are the compounds that these species prefer in the nectar, and that will help us with the plant selection. When we look at, looking at some videos, here is Bombus, this is in Western Mass. This is Bombus terricola, male, feeding on goldenrod. It's got a really short tongue, right? And so it prefers the more open composite flowers. The males do. The workers, however, as I said, they like to bite holes. And if we look at this orange touch-me-not, which is another critical, it should be in every habitat. Here's Bombus fervidus, the one that's in trouble. Beautiful looking bee, super long tongue, can get to the nectar, which is located at the base of the spur. And you'll never see a fervidus on this flower. Why? Because its tongue gets in the way. It can't outcompete short and medium tongue bees like this Bombus ternarius, which you also have in Western Mass. You'll see a lot of ternarius here, but you'll never see a fervidus. Similarly, you'll never see a ternarius on a jewelweed flower because it cannot get to the nectar. You will see terricola because it will bite a hole down here and steal the nectar. So it can wear two hats. It'll take the short ones, but if competition gets too much, it can go and compete with the long-tongue bees. So it's pretty flexible in that way. Okay, so that's nectar, their source of fuel. If we look at pollen, we see, this was the most shocking thing to come out of the work, I think, is that if we look at bees actively collecting pollen, we see that they only are actively collecting pollen from a couple of species, St. John's wort and meadowsweet. And all of the species seem to be favoring the same thing. So what this tells us is there's something about the pollen that is really good for them. We're going to figure out, again, it's the chemistry, we're going to figure that out. But that they are using plants differently. Some are nectar plants, some are pollen plants, and we need to have both in the habitat because they need pollen to produce new bees. And a lot of those nectar plants don't have the pollen quality that you need to produce new bees. So you want to give them what they want, which is the native roses. They even use the native plantains and a bunch of others on the list. So this is, again, just for July at a couple of sites. And again, they were observed on 25 plant species, but only using 2, primarily 1, as a source of pollen. Okay, so that being said, all of those species level differences, the problem is when we look at our plant list, this is, I think, from pollinator.org, we've got them all size fits one. Bumblebees, here's what we do. Digger bees, large carpenter bees. I just told you about the preferences for different species. And one thing I told you, that clover is absolutely critical for Bombus fervidus. Yet clover isn't even checked under bumblebees. I also told you that rose was a critical pollen source. And here it makes it seem like it carries equal weight with all these other things here. And they just don't. They do not. So we need to tailor the list to the species that we are targeting. The other problem here, the bee's knees and bee's buddies, I pulled these off the web. Notice they're all composite flowers, no tubular flowers, right? This is great for honeybees. They have a short tongue. This is great for all those medium and short tongue common bee species, but the long tongue bees are going to suffer. This one's a bit better. It's got some bee balm in it. It's got some lupin and some other things, but there are no pollen sources here, right? So they're getting their nectar, but they're not getting their pollen. And also, this doesn't go back early enough in the season to get those queens happy. So there's a lot going on before this comes into bloom and when this comes into bloom. So we need to start as soon as the snow starts to melt and those willows come out. That's the one we need to get those in place to get those queens coming out from hibernation and other bees and butterflies. And so here's looking at a seed mix. This is from Xerces Society. You know, they've done a great job getting the issue, public awareness on the issue. But when it comes to the actual conservation, they're really falling short in a scary way. So this is supposed to be, I think, for Bombus affinis or for species that are, it's conservation. So it's looking at species in trouble. We can see that in spring, the golden Alexanders and the lupin, first of all, the lupin is only 0.3%. If we want to help out Fervidus, which loves lupin, we're not doing it any service. There are no pollen plants here, and there's nothing before golden Alexanders. There's many things in bloom, but this is, when it says spring, it's on the later side. Looking through Penstemon digitalis, the hairy gold beard tongue they love, Penstemon digitalis they ignore. Impatiens likes it, some smaller bees, but bang for your buck, this should not be on the list. As well as the echinacea. Echinacea will pull in a couple of butterflies and some bimaculatus, but these ones aren't going to touch it. So we really need to think about, you can see how things are loaded to late summer, and we're not getting the bees what they need to get to that point anyway. So we need to try to fix that. So, and the other thing is, and a lot of lists have non-native species. And so this past year, what I did was I asked people to stop mowing certain areas. And in one area, there was a lot of red clover, and we saw Fervidus and even vagans and even some Terricola all over it. They stopped mowing, the prunella came in. Immediately, as soon as that prunella came into bloom, all of these bees, including Terricola, shifted over to prunella. That shows me that prunella is preferred, it's a native, preferred over the non-native. And this goes on the list. So we're now building the connections with the threatened bees, this flower, and anything that would be using prunella seed or other aspects of prunella at those higher trophic levels. That's how we use research to adjust the list and figure out what is the native that is supposed to be there instead of that non-native. The other thing is use straight species instead of cultivars. When you're planting your gardens, do not use cultivars. Cultivars have names like Miss Manners and all of these names in quotes. Avoid them like the plague. Why? Because it goes back to what we talked about with the selection. If we select for color, we're going to affect things linked to color. And if we're selecting for other traits, what happens is the plant only has so many resources to allocate, and if it puts them into color, it's going to take away from nectar, and that's what happens. And when we look at the preference, here's the native, here are all the variants of the native, and you can see that they don't prefer, there's a much lower preference for these cultivars than the straight species. Why? Because of the nectar. Here's another, because this is all from Annie White from University of Vermont, and I've been doing this as well, so it's not published yet. But if we look at Lobelia cardinalis for hummingbirds, and here's the cultivar, they look identical to us. They look, you know, just as beautiful. We look at the nectar. Here's the native. Here's the cultivar. Look at that drop in volume. Hummingbirds are not going to waste their energy trying to get that much nectar, and neither are bees. So you've got a nice flower, but nothing's going to visit it, and you're taking that connection out of the system. So that's a major problem. Moving away from floral preferences, forage preferences, to now what about hibernation and nesting sites? We don't, you know, we need more data on floral preferences. We need even more data on hibernation and nesting sites. I started up a project this year where I constructed my own artificial nest sites, and I had great success with common species. The nest boxes out in the market now have about 20% success. I had 80 to 100% success with my nest site. We're moving that to look at threatened species. So we're making progress here. So eventually we'll be able to say, hey, put this in the habitat so you can support these threatened bees in terms of nest sites and hibernation sites as well. Keeping leaf litter is important because it acts as an insulating layer so they don't get frozen. That's why you shouldn't clean up. There are a lot of important things here, but we don't know exactly where they're hibernating, and this requires more research as well, but it's certainly helping to complete that life cycle that I talked about. So instead of having these lists that are sort of one size fits all and a crapshoot, just pick a couple things and you're okay, now we want to select things where we're restoring these systems and also ecological networks in trouble. So if we plant native roses, all bumblebee species in decline use those roses for pollen. We have the apple sphinx moth, which uses it as a host plant. Things that feed on the larva, birds that feed on the larva. Also, the moth itself, we've got things like eastern whippoorwills that are in trouble that are feeding on the adult stage. Also, the products of pollination, we have a bunch of things that may be feeding on those rose hips. So just by planting this one native, you are helping, dozens, in some cases, of species, many of which are threatened. We look at nectar plants, yellow wild indigo, highly favored by threatened bumblebees, also host plant for these threatened butterflies. And then, there's less known about the connection to bird species at risk. But certainly just by planting this, you're helping at least 4 species of threatened pollinators, and also helping this plant species, which isn't as common as it used to be. Okay, so the Beecology Project, I'm going to introduce, and then we'll take another break. So as I mentioned, I'm conducting a lot of research. It's very difficult for me to do so by myself. When I was at WPI, it was extremely difficult because I was the only ecologist, and people were trying to get to med school and trying to get to, go into the health sciences more so. And so I had to think of how could I collect. I was seeing interesting data, and I wanted to continue, and how could I do this on a large scale? And I thought, well, I know a lot of people are concerned about pollinators, and so I said, what a better way than to get citizens to help me do so? And the Beecology Project was born. Initially, I told people to send me photos. That evolved into sending me videos, and then I had so many videos I didn't know what to do with them, and then I teamed up with computer scientists at WPI. So WPI is really strong in computer science and engineering, and so together we were able to create this technology to help citizen science collect data, important data that I can use, and then can be brought into the classroom. So the Beecology Project is the research side, and the BioCS Bridge, which I'll talk about tomorrow, is using Beecology to develop this integrated curriculum that I talked about. So the goal is, first of all, to collect more ecological data, right? But the other goal is to get to restore and protect habitat. So which habitat, how do we restore? That's why I thought it was important to go into plant species selection and what we really need to focus and target and look for in terms of restoration and habitat. And then third, I want to give people the tools to be able to assess the impact. You can ID the species yourself so you know, hey, I've done a good thing here because I can see I've got threatened species where I didn't have them before. So for me, it's more the education and getting the tools to be able to do self-evaluation and critically analyze habitat and assess it and spread the word than it is to just get you to plan a bunch of things that I tell you to. I want you to see that you're making a change. That is, and looking at behavior, and the plant side as much as the pollinator side, this all separates the Beecology Project from other bumblebee like bee spotter and other things that are out there that are more taxonomy. Pollinator conservation is taxonomy heavy and ecology light, especially behavioral ecology. And so I'm trying to balance that out. So to collect data, we have the web app, which I'll talk about, where you can do short videos. The app will help you to ID not just the bee, but the plant and also the bee behavior. You put it into our database. And then after, you can visualize the data. You can look at what others have found, and you can use it to decide which plants to put in a given area. And I'll talk about that more tomorrow. Restore and protect habitats based on the data from my primary research and the Beecology Project. We developed these plant lists, which I gave you. So here's spring plants, the absolutely critical or you know, if you had to prioritize, here's what you should be putting in for the spring. So the lupin's there, but notice that there are 4 willow species coming in before the lupin. There are some low bush blueberries that are important, and this one is really important, Pedicularis canadensis, the Canadian wood betony. And so I'm trying to find sources, and I found sources for all these things, and I'm working with community groups to try to get seed sources and to get this to help to spread to schools and other places. So I'm able to locate everything that's on my list, and I can talk to you about sources as well if you're interested. Lastly, assessing the impact. So here's a checklist. You go down the list. If you score 10 out of 10, you're doing a great job. A lot of these things you probably are already doing. No pesticides, all native plants. But here's where we run into things. 4 species, at least 4 species at risk observed. Nectar and pollen foraging, and these species are observed through the season, not just at a week or on one plant, but you're keeping them through the whole season. That's where things get difficult. And then other trophic levels, like do you see birds feeding or nesting in the habitat? That helps to make those connections between the plants and other wildlife, and then the pollinators at one side as well. And then, you know, which species do I target? And I mentioned this before. So it's just looking for, so, you know, one of the activities could be, especially in the elementary level, is to create a wanted poster where you've got the bumblebee species you're looking for, and you take a picture and then you color a cartoon of the wanted poster and you give it to your parents or you give it to other people so that they can look for garden groups or whatever. So you have community outreach as well as learning about diversity and the differences between species. That's just one of many activities that you could do. Okay, with that, I'll take another quick break, and I see we're coming up to the end here. So I'll quickly go through the Beecology app. There's some homework that I want you to do. I had a feeling I'd be pressed for time, and also I usually do this the day of. And having a Zoom and going out in the field, because I'm in Framingham, it's difficult to do. So I'm going to try to do it this way. And if you have to leave, everything's going to be recorded, and hopefully this part will be up so you can check it out on your own time, hopefully before tomorrow. If not, you can check it out after the fact. All right, so we'll take a 5-minute break if that's okay with everybody.